along with notes and a copy of the questions and answers that are being submitted during the webinar. I'll start with a presentation and then open up the floor to your questions. You can either ask a question in the Q&A box that's going to be at the bottom of your screen, or you can ask your question out loud if you click the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. Please be aware that we have 2 more opportunities for stakeholder meetings this week. The first is a stakeholder meeting focused on residential property rental companies, which will be held from 3 o'clock to 4:30 p.m. tomorrow. The second is our third open house, which will be on Thursday, February 3rd from 2:30 to 4:30. And you can register for one or both of those the same way that you registered for this meeting on the town short-term rental initiative page. You can also complete our survey, which closes today, and you can share comments by using the comment form on the short-term rental initiative section of the town's website. With that being said, welcome to our second stakeholder meeting for short-term rental owners. And while this meeting is open to the public and all are welcome, it is focused on short-term rental owners. So this morning, I'd like to briefly summarize our efforts so far and then discuss our findings and learnings. We've received a tremendous amount of feedback on this initiative, and after learning that information and receiving the feedback, we made initial recommendations to the Public Planning Committee last week, and I'll describe those recommendations and our path forward. So I'll start by giving a presentation and sharing my screen. Give me one moment. Okay. So for today's meeting, we'll review the project purpose statement before taking a deeper look at short-term rental trends. I'll summarize the feedback we've received so far and pull together themes that we've heard. I'll draw conclusions based on the feedback we've received and our learnings. I'll review our preliminary policy framework, and then I'll review our plan for continuing to monitor and analyze short-term rental trends and their impacts. And I'll also let you know how you can participate and can continue to participate in this initiative. We are still listening and we are open to all feedback. The short-term rental initiative project purpose statement outlines what we're trying to do. We need to develop a fair, balanced, and predictable approach to managing short-term rental impacts. And this effort is part of our recently adopted strategic plan. First, as part of our learnings, let's take a look at the trends in short-term rentals in the past 2 years. So on this chart, we have data from 3 short-term rental monitoring companies, and we didn't list their names because they gave us this data as part of a software demonstration. So each of different colored lines represents a different company. And you can see, obviously, 2 of the companies provided us 2 data points from September 19 and September 21. And one of the companies provided us data for each month, or excuse me, each month throughout that process. So you can see the change in the trend. So starting back in September of 2019, the companies found there were between 4,000 and 6,000 short-term rentals on the island. 2 years later, in September of 2021, they found that number increased to between 8,000 and 11,500 units. And again, that blue line indicates quarterly data. And you can see the sharp increase between January 2021 and July of 2021, which leveled off in the third quarter last year, but it was still increasing. We'll confirm this data shortly with our short-term rental monitoring contract, which I'll mention in a minute. If you average the 3 estimates, that's a 96% increase in short-term rentals in 2 years, which is the equivalent of about 4,800 short-term rental units. Obviously, most of those units aren't new builds, they're conversions from existing housing units to short-term rentals. For context, 4,800 units is a little less than the total number of units in Palmetto Dunes. In 2018, we had about 34,500 housing units on the island. So these trend lines show a sharp change in the short-term rental market. And given the size and importance of the short-term rental market on the island, this clearly warrants our attention and further analysis. It's a sudden increase and it's a big change, but does it indicate a problem? I think we can draw some preliminary conclusions from this trend data and the feedback we received, which I'll discuss in a minute. Regarding data acquisition, we decided to work with AirDNA to provide constant monitoring of short-term rental properties, and their initial data will be available shortly. This will give us a comprehensive picture of short-term rentals, including the total number of rentals verified by the company. So instead of having an estimate, we'll have a verified number. And the data will be captured by month, starting from November 2014 through today. We'll have data on the listing types, so single family home, multifamily home, the location, the maximum occupancy, number of bedrooms, the date the property was first offered as a short-term rental, obviously going back to November 2014, the time of the year that properties are rented, and the number of nights rented per year. We'll also have monthly performance information like total reservation days and occupancy, so we can take a look at those trends. With that information, we can do a deeper dive on short-term rental trends by location, not just absolute numbers. And we can use AirDNA to continue to monitor short-term rental trends. So will the trend of a sharp increase in short-term rental units continue? Maybe not at the same rate that the blue line showed between January 2021 and July 2021. You can see that blue line is already leveling off, but will it increase again, or has the market settled? The information will be very useful as we continue to monitor short-term rentals using AirDNA. The short-term rental trend information is part of what we use to consider short-term rentals. Another input was stakeholder feedback. Starting in October, we've held 19 open houses, individual meetings, and group meetings with stakeholders. We saw a broad range of input and kind of widened that input as we went along and added additional meetings to make sure we were capturing as many viewpoints as possible. So we've got realtors, the Chamber of Commerce, short-term rental owners like yourselves, property management companies, neighborhood representatives. And you can see here we spoke with Sea Pines Resort, a group of vacation rental industry experts, a self-titled group, representing a number of industries related to short-term rentals. Palmetto Dunes, we held an open house. Utility companies, property management companies. We recently held meetings focused on South and North Island residents, or excuse me, Mid and North Island residents, and then South Island residents. And so we've really tried to cover a wide range. The meetings that we held 2 weeks ago, we had about 500 people attend. The 5 meetings that we held last week. And let me just take a quick second to thank and recognize staff who helped put those together and run those meetings, especially Renee Phillips, who is running our webinar today. It's a tremendous amount of work and everyone's done a great job. As I mentioned, the meetings from these videos are now on the town's website, and we'll add the notes and Q&A for those shortly. We have our upcoming meetings here, including the meetings today. What we heard in those meetings that 2 weeks ago was largely what we've heard before. The same themes, the same problems and concerns are resonating again and again. And I'll discuss those in a minute. We've had an overwhelming response for our survey. I just checked, we've had more than 3,600 responses, which is really great feedback and helpful for us. Everyone can view the survey responses on the same page that you used to take the survey. Just click the feedback button. And I want to acknowledge and thank everyone who's taken the time to take those surveys. Your feedback is really invaluable and really helps us understand everyone's perspective and concerns, and I really appreciate it. So while feedback can be very specific and detailed, what we heard fell into, as I said, different themes. The first and possibly most important point that I want to make is obvious, but sometimes we need to say obvious points out loud. As Jocelyn Steiger with the Hilton Head Area Association of Realtors said, we can't just focus on problems. We need to focus on the benefits that short-term rentals provide and make sure that we speak to those. Everyone that we spoke with acknowledged that short-term rentals are integral to the island's economy and its character. Short-term rental owners subsidize full-time residents' taxes, they pay tax fees, they increase property values, and they stimulate the local economy. They also help build Hilton Head Island's long-term resident community. So as we all know, many of our full-time residents started out as either guests in someone else's short-term rental, or they purchased a house or a condo that they rented out until they moved here full-time. So to be clear, no one wants to do away with short-term rentals. We understand that they are an important part of our economy and the fabric of the island. We also heard people ask, why are you doing this? What is the problem? Do we have a problem? We certainly heard from folks who think there's no problem at all. So someone on the survey said, fine as is, no change. But we heard from many people who are experiencing the strain that short-term rentals are having on their neighborhoods. So during a stakeholder meeting a couple of weeks ago, Mr. McCammon, who's a long-time resident, described how the behavior of guests in a short-term rental next to his home had severely and negatively impacted his quality of life. We've heard and read complaints about these quality of life issues again and again. There are too many vehicles and they park on the street, or they park in the yard, or they park on my yard. The renters play loud music and party, which I can hear inside my house, and they leave out trash and they litter. And so if you ask, do we have a problem? Based on the trends we've seen and the feedback we've received, I would say with the dramatic increase in the number of short-term rental units in the past few years, there's an even greater need to address those quality of life issues by requiring a basic level of operation and management for short-term rental properties. So many short-term rental owners have responded to this by saying, not my rental. I take pride in owning a well-maintained property. I set occupancy limits. I require a minimum night stay. I screen my guests. I respond to calls when problems come up. And I think that's true. I think many short-term rental properties are well managed, and that's demonstrable. And I think it shows that no one finds these kinds of nuisances acceptable because everyone wants to take care of them. We've also heard and read concerns about deeper rooted issues, like the decline of residential neighborhoods as they transition to commercial districts full of mini hotels. This includes neighborhoods inside the larger gated communities that allow short-term rentals, and those outside gated communities like North Forest Beach and Folly Field. Some of the other deeper rooted issues we've heard about include the impacts of the rising number of short-term rentals on housing availability, on the quality of the environment, on infrastructure, on the island's brand, and on the value of short-term rentals themselves. So people have asked, will the market be saturated, and therefore will the average night stay fall? So if you ask, do we have a problem with these issues? I think the answer is, I'm not sure we know yet. There's certainly been a change in short-term rentals, and there is certainly some amount of encroachment on traditional neighborhoods, some amount of additional burden on the environment and our infrastructure, and there could be some market saturation, but we just don't have enough information to quantify that issue yet. So we've considered all this feedback and what we know about trends in short-term rentals, and we developed our preliminary findings. So our feedback and learnings to date show that there is strong support for an ordinance to address the organization, character, expectations, and operations of short-term rentals. So most folks agree, as Jack Daly said during one of the stakeholder meetings a couple of weeks ago, that there needs to be some sort of basic level of expectations for short-term rentals. So I'd refer you to the feedback in the surveys, the stakeholder meetings and open houses, and the calls and emails we've received that echo that sentiment. We also found that at this time, with the information we have, there's limited support for an ordinance that would significantly impact the operations of short-term rentals before we fully understand and evaluate the problem and the results of what our actions would be. So if you ask, do we have a problem with the total number of short-term rentals on the island, I would say, I don't have enough information to know yet. But the recent rise in the number of short-term rentals certainly warrants further monitoring and consideration. As we have more information on short-term rental trends through our continuous monitoring contract, and as we gather more information through the island-wide conditions and trends assessment, which is another initiative of the strategic plan, we can evaluate the sorts of larger concerns like the quality of traditional single-family neighborhoods and the simultaneous reduction in the amount of worker housing and the increased demand for workers that you have with more visitors and more short-term rentals, and the burden of infrastructure and the impact on the environment. So based on the feedback we've received in our learnings to date, we recommended to the Public Planning Committee last week a preliminary policy framework, including standards for property management, safety, noise, trash, and parking. I'll detail each of these first before describing how this information would be submitted, compliance with these standards would be submitted with the town's business license application. Regarding property management, we want to create a standard that owners or their agents will be available to address problems within an hour of being notified. And that agent can be anyone the owner designates who can respond, and that includes family members or friends. The key is that someone is available to respond within an hour to address the issue. The contact information for that person would be posted outside of the unit so folks know who to contact in case of a problem. Many communities with short-term rental ordinances require this, and it reflects what we've heard in stakeholder meetings and read in the surveys. When neighbors have a problem with renters, they want a point of contact who will handle the issue in a reasonable amount of time. Regarding safety, we recommend requiring owners to affirm that their units meet basic safety requirements like fire prevention and escape routes and pool safety standards. If in some cases, pool fencing would violate private covenants, and we would consider exempting those properties from that requirement or finding an alternative safety option that doesn't violate the covenants. So I'm sure we'll refine this as we receive more feedback, but there should be some basic life safety measures for each unit. Similarly, we recommend requiring owners to affirm that they've notified guests of the town's noise standards, specifically that it's unlawful to unreasonably disturb the peace and quiet of those who are in their homes, and that quiet hours are between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. And by posting those notifications, guests will be expected to comply with the noise standards. We recommend that owners affirm that they have a designated location, a service yard or a dumpster for trash, and that they clearly display the instructions about putting away waste and where that location is located within the unit. So if the service yard is located around back or maybe in an area that wouldn't be immediately obvious, that the owners notify guests where that is. To clarify, we included dumpsters because some multifamily developments have dumpsters instead of individual service yards. So multifamily developments with dumpsters that they're already required to screen those from view of the street. That's part of the development review process. So we wouldn't be inviting single family homeowners or multifamily developments to put out new dumpsters to meet this requirement. Regarding parking, we recommend requiring that vehicles be parked on site that's on the location of the short-term rental. So not in common space or not on the street near the short-term rental, but on the side of the short-term rental. In compliant parking spaces, and that the maximum number of vehicles would be limited to 6. To clarify, that would be a maximum of 6 spaces for the sites that are designated to accommodate 6 spaces. So if your site can only accommodate 4 spaces, that maximum number would be 4 spaces. And there may be some larger properties that can truly reasonably accommodate more than 6 vehicles, and we're discussing options for those properties. And the parking must comply with private covenants. If you have covenants that state your designated parking can't be on pine straw, for example, you would still need to meet that requirement. So those are the elements of the policy framework. You can see from the survey responses, from the feedback from short-term rental management companies, the letter from Sea Pines Resort, that there are some questions about some of the specifics, and we need to iron out those details. But there is strong support for some basic universal standards for how short-term rentals operate. And as I said before, many short-term rental owners, and you may be thinking yourself, I already take care of my property. For you and for those folks, meeting these requirements should only involve submitting some additional paperwork along with your business license. So I'll describe that and how and when this would go into effect. So since all short-term rentals now have to have a town business license, you would submit the required information that we just described above with your business license application. This wouldn't require an additional fee. You would simply add the information to your business license application or your application renewal, affirming that you meet the requirements. Staff recommended that the effective date of the ordinance be July 1st, 2022. And so what does that mean? That means that everyone who already has a 2022 business license or who has submitted a business license application by July 1st, 2022 would not have to submit the additional paperwork confirming that you meet the requirements, and you wouldn't have to meet the requirements for the rest of this calendar year. So if they have or have applied for their 2022 business license before these regulations go into effect, you wouldn't have to meet them until next year. For those who apply for a business license or renew their business license after July 1st, 2022, you would need to submit the additional paperwork confirming that you meet these requirements, and you would have to meet these requirements starting July 1st, whenever you submit your business license application. So let me run through a few scenarios. So if you are a short-term rental owner and you have your business license today, you do not need to submit, if this ordinance is approved, you would not need to submit any additional paperwork, and you would not need to meet these requirements until you submit your business license application renewal in January of 2023. At that point, with your business license application renewal, you would submit the paperwork affirming that you meet these requirements, and you need to start meeting all of these requirements starting January 1st, 2023. If you are a short-term rental owner and you submit your business license application after July 1st, 2022, you would need to submit the additional paperwork confirming that you meet these requirements and start meeting the requirements as of July 1st or the date when you submit your application and it's approved. The town will provide a good neighbor brochure to be displayed in units. This is very common in communities with short-term rentals. It welcomes folks to the community. It kind of sets up the expectations that we have and provides some continuity between those requirements. We have received a request that there be modifications allowed to that, and I think that's something that we can discuss as part of this process. As with all town regulations, the goal would be voluntary compliance with the ordinance. We realize that this is a large change. We have a large number of short-term rental units, and so a great deal of education is going to be required. So we're coordinating with our communications department and are making sure that we will make everyone aware of these new requirements and how they can meet them. So your first violation of the ordinance would not result in any kind of citation. It would result in education of the requirements and notification of those requirements. However, if there is a property owner who repeatedly fails to meet the basic standards for their business to meet these requirements, the ultimate result could be that town council could review revoking their business license. But again, we would want to take all steps possible to make sure that the property owner is aware of the requirements and understands how to meet those requirements. And no one expects perfection. We understand that you're going to have outlying guests who don't meet the behavioral standards that we would expect, and I think consideration will be given for that. In terms of next steps, last week on January 27th, the Public Planning Committee approved this preliminary policy framework. They had comments and questions on several elements. We've already received quite a bit of feedback on these proposed recommendations, and we are continuing to solicit public input, including today. We want to know what you think about these requirements. We want to know what your questions are and what your comments are. With the committee feedback and public input, we will work with our code writing consultants to draft an ordinance. And we'll present that draft ordinance to the Public Planning Committee at their Thursday, February 24th meeting. The Public Planning Committee will review the draft ordinance and provide further direction to staff. So they'll either direct us to revise the ordinance, or if it's ready, to forward the ordinance to Town Council for review. In the meantime, staff will continue monitoring and evaluating the effects of short-term rental on residential neighborhoods and the housing stock, those larger deep-rooted issues that I mentioned before. With our continuous monitoring software contract and with the data we're collecting under the island-wide conditions and trends assessment, we can continue to determine whether the impacts of the short-term rental trends are sufficient to warrant further action. So before I open up the meeting to questions, I wanted to clarify a couple points. First, we welcome all feedback, and this isn't the only venue to share your feedback. There's a form on the town's website you can use to submit additional feedback, and all of that is shared with the Public Planning Committee, including any emails that you send to staff. You can also submit comments to the committee before any of their meetings and sign up to speak during their meetings. Just a note, we're trying to promptly respond to every communication we receive, but please understand that there might be a delay due to the volume that we're receiving right now and the interest in this. The second point is that we're working out the details of these requirements and procedures. So these recommendations were presented in a draft format intentionally because we wanted to get the committee's feedback before proceeding to work out the details of implementing these recommendations. So these draft concepts are based on other communities' best practices and the recommendations of our code writing consultants. So the answer to your question might be, we're working on that right now. So we may not have a specific answer to your question today, but I really appreciate the feedback and helping us work through the remainder of these recommendations. So with that, again, if you'd like to ask a question for the entire webinar, please select the raise hand button using the hand symbol at the bottom of your screen, or you can use the Q&A button to type a question and staff will respond. And again, a recording of the webinar will be made available on the town's website, along with a summary of the live and written questions. So let me stop sharing my screen. And I'll open up the floor to questions. We'll start with Dustin Krantz. Mr. Krantz?
Hey, Ann, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. First of all, I just want to say, and I've listened to a few of these meetings so far, and I know everyone keeps saying it and you're probably getting tired of hearing it, but you do a great job mediating these meetings. Thank you, Ann, for your patience. I would not want to be in your shoes, and you handle it with grace. So that was my first point. I do have a couple points, though, to talk through. So number one, I feel like the town's jumping the gun a little bit here. Really, this all starts with noise complaints, parking, garbage, etc. I've heard a few comments before regarding why don't we just follow the law and call the cops on those people? That's what I would do. I just don't understand why we're jumping to a short-term rental ordinance right away. Secondly, so far the data is kind of what I have a big problem with. I work with numbers all day long, and I can tell you that you can manipulate numbers to say anything you want to. We have 3 companies, ABC so far, that have showed us increases in the trend of short-term rentals. Who are the companies? I know you said you're not sharing it currently. How do they calculate these numbers? Are they double counting? I've heard timeshares are being included, which I don't really feel like is an accurate representation. And I feel like that kind of skews the overall average percentage that you pointed to initially in this meeting. As we can see, there's a sharp increase in January 21. Obviously, this is a no surprise because of COVID. Jobs are more flexible. People are able to travel more who would not have been renting out their home previously. Obviously, that probably leads to a sharp increase. So I'm still curious, what exactly is the problem? Thirdly, we just had the new business license ordinance passed in September. It goes into effect this month of this year. I don't see why we wouldn't go with that, see if that gets rid of a number of short-term rentals, maybe people who would have been renting them out previously, kind of on an ad hoc basis, would stop doing it, which would lead to that number decreasing and maybe leveling out again. So I don't know. Back to my initial statement, I just feel like the town is jumping the gun on this a little bit. And those are my 3 points I wanted to discuss. So thank you.
Thanks, Dustin. I appreciate you joining us this morning. I just wanted to mention a couple of follow-ups to the comments that you made. In terms of jumping the gun and why not call the cops on folks where you've had issues? There are a couple of issues. I think there is a concern among folks about using police resources for nuisance issues that could be better handled by the business owner themselves, the property owner. The Beaufort County Sheriff's Department doesn't respond to trash issues at all. So there are some small issues that I think could be better handled by the business owner, and that's what we've heard. Regarding information gathering, we'll share the information that we have from Air DNA. Effectively, the software monitoring companies scrape the internet for data. The reason that I think you'll see some variation in the numbers that were provided were the verification process. So once you get the data, the companies actually use a human to verify 2 to 3 points of data to verify the location and the fact that they're not double counting those listings. So I think there's some variation there. There's also some variation in how you'll never get a precise number, I think, for short-term rentals, depending on when you ask. So for example, there are a lot of folks who will come down here for the winter, and maybe during the summer, they rent out their property as a short-term rental. So depending on when you do your scrape of the data, that property may be or may not be listed as a short-term rental. So you see some variation there. And in regarding to the increase that you mentioned, I think it seems likely, though I certainly don't know the future, that that sharp increase is not going to happen again. But it does seem like there's not going to be a sharp decrease in the number of short-term rentals that we have. I think those are primarily not due to new timeshares, but due to a change in use from an existing either condo or single-family house to a short-term rental. So those nuisance issues that we see that have become even more problematic for folks, I think those aren't going to go away. So I hope that provides some context or some additional information about what you brought up, and I thank you for your comments. Mr. Carlson?
Hi, Ann. How are you doing this morning?
Hi, good morning.
Hi. So a couple things. I have a background in criminal justice, law enforcement, people with nefarious backgrounds, and mostly trying to help them change their ways if they so choose. So a couple things I'd like to mention here. One, I agree with that last caller that there is a system that's been implemented by the island, and we don't know how that system's going to work yet. So adding to a system that we don't know if it's already proved its purpose may seem, kind of folly. Secondly, if we're going to be posting notifications outside of units for people to call if there's troublesome tenants, sounds great. However, you've also just said that unit is mostly unoccupied. So what you've done is you've added a list of units for burglars and thieves to survey and potentially target. So that's a huge issue for me. And then I believe there was something about having people only park on their property, or the property allotted. Was that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay. I guess how would you ever even know that? Because somebody with, let's say, an Indiana license plate may be day tripping or evening tripping from a hotel in Savannah. How would that ever possibly be enforceable? So I think there's a tendency to blame subgroups when we don't like changes. And in this particular instance, the subgroup appears to be short-term renters. But we really don't know, but it's the easiest group to point fingers at this point in time. That's pretty much what I have to say.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Just a note, and I thank you for bringing up Dustin's point again, because I meant to mention that the change in the business license requirement is not that we're now requiring business licenses for short-term rentals. It's that there's no longer an exemption for folks who have one short-term rental. So everyone is required, if you have a short-term rental, to have a business license. So just a note that is that change. And then regarding your point on parking, I think there's some desire to have a pass or some sort of notification in the vehicle that this vehicle is associated with this short-term rental unit. That way the number of passes matches up with the unit. And so we can identify if folks are parked, if someone doesn't have a pass and they've parked illegally, we can immediately identify that they're not associated with a short-term rental and try to address the issue that way. Ms. Marshall?
Thank you for letting me comment. I've previously sent emails and participated in the January 20th online, but I'd like to follow up on these slides. First, I'd like to address the comments about the increasing number of short-term rentals, STRs. So even though they're increasing, that doesn't impact the number of housing units and bedrooms. You still have the same number of occupants. In fact, if they're not year-round and the units are only rented, let's say 9 months solid, or at least even 365 days a year, you have less people on the island. Year-round residents are more of a drain on resources and services like fire, police, schools than visitors. The second point is that a good STR owner will have in place everything in your framework. A good booking agent, mine is 24 hours, so they're around the clock. Property manager, housekeeper for management and guest support, safety equipment in the unit, and the HOA with their rules and their fines, they cover the safety, trash, and parking passes. So you probably just need to establish enforcement on some of these for all STRs, like the ones who do not collect and submit accommodation taxes. I think that's more important, collecting all the A taxes than some of these things. And a note, all beach and summer communities have issues regarding tourists. I mean, they all do. I've lived in them, and in summer it gets pretty rowdy. Finally, I believe the focus of planning and zoning should be on the development on the island. The island has been steadily impacted by development since we began visiting and owning in 2008. Every time we come down, we notice the island has become less wild and natural. More little cottages and housing, less palm trees, less Spanish moss and canopy. For example, Beach City Road. More issues impacting safety. The number of traffic accidents is remarkable. The environment and general quality of life could be attributed to overdevelopment. So I'm not sure why STRs are being demonized when the real culprit is overdevelopment. I know it's politically charged, but it's past time to implement more planning and zoning restrictions and deny building applications. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall. I appreciate you joining us today, and I appreciate your previous comments. Just a note about the issue that you mentioned regarding overdevelopment on the island. That's something I've certainly heard from a number of people in recent years. That's a very common comment that we've heard. And in fact, one of the town's strategic plan initiatives is an island-wide conditions and trends assessment. And we're just starting that process now. But I think that will give us the information we need to make decisions going forward in the future about how to address the sense that some folks have that there is too much development on the island. I think if we can have some additional metrics to assess and measure that, that'll help town council make decisions in the future and about what we want to look like as an island. So thank you for your input, and I appreciate that. Okay. Oh, Mr. Prashaka, I'm sorry, I should know how to pronounce your last name. think you may need to unmute.
Yep,
yourself.
I'm good. Good
Oh,
morning.
there you are. Thank you.
I am Alan Prohaska. I'm the
Prohaska,
president. of the-
thank you, sir.
Yep. I am the president of the Summer House Horizontal Property Regime on Marshland Road. We have 194 units. We're a conglomeration of resident owners, second homeowners, investor property. Our master deed does not allow short-term rentals. I also own a condo in Shorewood on South Forest Beach Drive. It's our primary home for 7 months of the year. My wife is on the board of the building. We have 126 units in the complex. They're all short-term rentals unless an individual owner chooses otherwise. We've owned on the island since 2011. Our unit's been represented by Resort Rentals, which was bought by Vacasa, and now we're managed by Sunset Rentals. We're active owners. We rent to offset our costs. I have several points. I submitted my survey in December. I listened to, digested, studied, and researched your presentation. My wife and I came in and met with you on January 7th. I read and reviewed the feedback, your questions posted online. I've watched every stakeholder meeting. I watched the January Public Planning Commission meeting. I've spoken to short-term rental property management companies. I spoke to Tom Reed at Charter One. He spoke against this at one of the forums. I've spoken to several short-term rental owners. Yesterday, I spoke to my Ward 3 rep, Tamara Baker. Your presentation indicated you've spoken to several groups. Smart City Policy Group, a company out of Austin, Texas, made up of Austin natives. An advocacy group for vacation rental management companies, a software company called Inhabitant IQ, Forest Beach Owners Association, which represents no properties, they just are a self-appointed group. Coastal Home and Villa, which represents 57 properties. Island Time, another property management company, which was just founded in 2019 with only 105 properties. So you didn't talk to Vacasa, who has 300 rentals. One property sleeps 26 in Sea Pines, 4 sleep 20, 3 in Sea Pines, 1 in Forest Beach. Vacation Company, who has 376 properties, 2 which sleep 21 and 23. VRBO, I don't know if you spoke to anybody nationally. They have 107 properties alone on the island that sleep 20. They have 11 that sleep 26, and they have 2 that sleep 30. Airbnb, 138 properties, which sleep 16 adults, which is the max allowed. Sea Pines, Forest Beach, Folly Field. The average price is $35 to $50 per night. Now what we're getting down to is we're talking about party houses. And that price is per person. I saw you also did not talk to IMC, which is a property management company that represents 80 horizontal property regimes on the island. Those folks understand covenants and how short-term rentals operate in the regime. Somebody's already spoken about your data. I do understand that AirDNA deals with Airbnb and VRBO, more for people like me who are buying, not in communities who are analyzing. Of your survey data, is a short-term rental ordinance needed? Total respondents, 3,535, 35% say yes, 43% no. You've had numerous people, even one on this call, who said they didn't know what the problem was. You've offered your property management issues on safety, noise, trash, parking, short-term rentals, but you haven't clearly delineated in any of these sessions what the problem is. Yet at that January 27th meeting, the 4 members of the council voted 3-1 to bring an ordinance forward based on the policy framework you put together. None of them owned short-term rental property, and only Mrs. Becker voted against it. After that meeting, when I spoke to Mrs. Becker in the planning meeting and during our phone call, it was clear to the 2 of us, the real problem is house hotels being built mainly in North Forest Beach and non-HOA areas around Folly Field, Bradley Beach, and Singleton Beach. Small, what I would call beach bungalows, are being replaced by house hotels, which accommodate anywhere from 18 to 34 occupants and are solely for rental purposes. The town issues building permits without conducting infrastructure, impact studies, water, sewer, roads, trash hauling, safety. You let them be built. You've come to us with a policy framework which for short-term rental owners, 1 hour response time. At times, problems are occurring after business hours. That's not reality. Typical response next business day. People should call 911. Posting on the outside of the property, a contact number. Hilton Head has signage regulations as well as HOAs. Somebody already mentioned that this could be a problem for criminals. It also says that if people have to trespass to read that number to call, they could face confrontations from the rental guests. Mr. Stanford in that policy meeting talked about fining. Now you have enforcement costs. Pull a license for violations. Now you have legal costs because somebody could sue you for eminent domain violations. It's clear the town needs to focus on regulating house hotels, perhaps a single family home that sleeps more than X number of adults. Do not burden those of us who own, rent 1 to 3 bedroom villas, condos, and our second homes with 4 or 5 bedrooms because a handful of house hotels are nuisances to the neighborhood they are in. In summary, while staff has put a significant amount of effort, your methodology appears to be flawed. No economic impact study has been commissioned. 50% of respondents don't think we need a short-term rental ordinance, yet Planning Committee has agreed to move an ordinance forward over Mrs. Becker's objection. Guess whose ward has all the problems? It's hers. You have to ask yourself why she is not in favor. As a side note, no one on the Planning Committee owns short-term rentals, and I can find no evidence of other council members or staff members owning this. I have offered to staff and to Mrs. Becker to be on a task force with the necessary stakeholders, and I've offered to chair the task force. I continue to make that offer. If you don't slow this process down, Hilton Head will be negatively impacted. Do not underestimate the law of unintended consequences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Prohaska. And I appreciate your continued participation. I appreciate all the time that you spent on this and the information that you've given us. And you covered a wide range of issues. I just wanted to mention a couple of notes. We're hoping that by setting a minimum level of property management for these businesses, that will reduce and alleviate some of the immediate quality of life issues that some folks are having. And we're hoping that the additional information that we're gathering with AirDNA and with the island-wide conditions and trends assessment will give us an idea of what extent we have and what locations we have a problem with these commercial districts with mini hotels. And then we can more fully consider what steps we might want to take to address those in the future. Thank you very much for your comments. I really appreciate it. Mr. Skelton.
Yes, good morning, and thank you very much for having this for everybody to see and listen. Start with, I am a short-term renter. I have a 3-bedroom home in Palmetto Dunes. I follow all the rules and regulations. I agree with what Palmetto Dunes has done, and I think they're on the edge of what should be done with the 1 hour. But I'm also on Nextdoor website for Hilton Head. And the complaints that I'm hearing are coming from areas, HOAs, that don't allow short-term rentals. Everybody's upset. The main reason is traffic on the island. Hilton Head is a popular destination, and it seems that let's take it out on the short-term renters, you know? If I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. Mini hotels, as the last person was saying, there's not all that many, and these were purpose-built, and the town lost sight of that. But going forward, I think there's, you know, I hope this just doesn't come out to be another tax grab to for business licenses and profit. A lot of people aren't making. A small person like myself, we're not making profit. We're covering our costs. You know, I look at the jobs that I create. You know, landscaping personnel to maintain the exterior of my property, cleaning companies to clean after a guest has come and gone. You know, pool companies that maintain pools, and not to say how much money I spend at local Graco hardware. You know, all all the businesses around the island and off island, Bluffton or whatever, the money that's spent on golf courses, a lot of this is the short-term rental. And one thing I'm seeing, VRBO is being, they're the devil incarnate, but if you listen to some people, I use VRBO. I live in a gated community, and my gated community tells me when somebody lodges a complaint against my property, I have to reply within the hour. Well, I'm not getting complaints. I know, and when you get down to it, Palmetto Dunes always has been. It was designed as a resort, not a residential community like Hilton Head Plantation, Port Royal, Indigo Run. There's big differences. I hope that you'll leave the HOAs alone and have them, but insist that they must have a policy. You know, that's all I can say. Thank you very much for allowing me to talk.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Skelton. I really appreciate you joining us today, and I appreciate your comments. I think it's important for us to, when we're considering how these will be implemented, to understand how these overlap and interact with HOA requirements. And we're working on that right now. We're coordinating with the larger gated communities and with other POAs and HOAs. And I just wanted to mention, in terms of a tax grab, what we're proposing would not be would not require a new fee. Your business license requirement, which I believe the change in the exemption to folks who own one short-term rental was to bring the town's business license ordinance in line with the state requirements. So there was a state bill that required uniformity in business license collections, and that was an exemption that we had that was out of step with the rest of the state. So I believe we are now in line with the rest of the state in collecting business licenses. So that was a requirement that we made separate from this this initiative. And our goal is to have, again, relieve some of those nuisance issues for folks and have a method for short-term rental owners who are not currently managing their properties in a state that a lot of folks are. So a lot of short-term rental owners like yourself are doing an excellent job managing their properties. And hopefully this requirement will be a minimum of amount of effort for them. You'll need to submit additional amount of paperwork, but pay no additional fee. And if you continue to manage your property as you have been, there should be no issue at all. So I appreciate your joining us today, and I appreciate your comments. Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Carlson?
Hey, Ann. Hey, I just wanted to touch
Hey.
on a response that you had to my discussion. So you had mentioned for people to be putting some sort of tag or something in their window. That's great, but I guess my point was that's essentially completely unenforceable, because you have no idea if someone has a tag in the glove box, in their backpack, they left it on the kitchen counter. So it just seems like another step, but that actually truly does nothing. Secondly, I was on one of these meetings, I don't know, whatever the first round of meetings were, and I really do not understand why the island is so against parking enforcement. Ticket and or tow. That is how you solve this problem. Put up proper signage so that people are aware. If they illegally park, they're going to get a ticket. What that does is it shows everyone else who's considering illegal parking, look, that person got a ticket. Secondly, if the island cares that much, pull the cars. I assure you that when people are pulling up and they see a tow truck hooking a car, the next 40 cars don't want any part of it. But for some reason, the island seems to be really against doing what works in every other area of really the US, especially in beach communities. So a lot of this seems to be trying to simplify an already simple answer. Like, you don't want to inconvenience people. You don't want to write them a ticket. You don't want to do this. You don't want to do that. Well, that's what works. So pulling all these other things and having all these other, restrictions or stickers or tags or whatever you want to call them, essentially useless and a complete waste of time. Ticket or tow. That's it. That's the answer. Works everywhere else. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Carlson. I appreciate your follow-up comments. Just in regard to ticket or tow, I know that and I'm not trying to speak for town council, but I know that our philosophy with many code enforcement issues is education first. And I think that it is fair to educate folks about our parking policies. And this would be part of the educational process. You know, welcome to our island. We're glad to have you as a guest. And here's where you can and can't park, and try to educate folks before ticketing or towing. You know, it could be that town council wants to take a different direction with this, but that is the direction that we've received in the past. Thank you. Mr. Conkle?
Hi, it's Mrs. Conkle.
Oh, Mrs. Conkle.
I'm on my husband's name, sorry.
Sure.
I have one unit that I bought in 2011, and I do some short-term rental in the summer especially. And I really feel that the pandemic has really increased the rentals because people couldn't go anywhere. So I had many more rentals from people, not my usual people. So I think people got stimulus money. I had people paying VRBO the whole rental right away. And I think this is definitely going to drop off. I already see January, I usually have things booked. People are not booking like they did last year because now with the vaccine, they can go wherever they want. And I think more people are going to stop dropping off considerably. The other thing is the amount of development in Bluffton, where we come from Pittsburgh, that we know 5 families that have moved down here permanently to Bluffton. They're coming on the island to go to dinner. They're coming here to go to the beach. So there is so much traffic, and I think it's people coming here from off the island mostly. And the other thing is, what scares me about this is the licensed manager. So I have to get somebody that has a license to come. That was in the proposal that I got on an email. And I have somebody on the island who lives here, and he comes and helps people out when they can't work the remote or they're having an issue. I call Mitch, he comes over, we take care of it. I have an HOA. They're very restrictive on the parking. So I don't know, it's just costs more and more every year. And now I need a business license, and it just starts to get really depressing. I mean, paying the taxes is so difficult for somebody who doesn't have that background. I mean, you pay certain taxes between, April and September, and then some I have to pay quarterly, and then you have your school taxes, and it's just on and on. It just seems it keeps piling on. That's all. Okay, thank you. Everybody made such great comments. I'm really enjoying this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Conkle. Thank you for joining us. I just want to mention, I think your point is exactly right, that I think there is a drastic change, I think definitely due to the pandemic, in the number of short-term rental units that are currently being offered.
Unmuted.
I think that our data, our monitoring service will be able to really give us an idea if that trend continues. And no, we've seen a short rise in those numbers, even continuing, not as steep, but I think it's important for us to understand, is that trend going to reverse itself? Is it going to level out? Are we going to have a slow and steady rise? We won't know that, obviously, but I think in taking a look at those trends, we can better understand what steps we might want to make in the future. The regulations that we're proposing now aren't meant to address traffic. They're meant to address nuisance issues. So I take your point about increased traffic on the island, and that is something I think certainly everyone recognizes and has commented on, especially outside of what you would consider the traditional tourist seasons here. And yeah, I've certainly noticed that myself. In terms of fees, again, we aren't asking folks to pay an additional fee. You are required to get a business license, which was separate from this initiative, but our proposal is that you would submit paperwork affirming that you meet these requirements with your business license renewal application. Regarding a licensed manager, that's not something that we've proposed. What we propose is that you have a contact for someone who can respond to and address issues within an hour. So that doesn't need to be a licensed property manager. That again can be a family member or a friend or however you want to make that arrangement. So thank you for your comments. I really appreciate you joining us today. Mr. Wagner?
Hi, this is actually Mrs.
Oh,
Wagner.
Mrs. Wagner.
I guess one comment is we're actually in Shipyard in Evian, but a good friend purchased a small unit on near Bradley Beach and has just and they just purchased it this past June. They have one small driveway in a 3-bedroom unit. So does that mean they will be required to not have any parking on the street? First question. Second, we started coming to Hilton Head 30 plus years ago, and it is a resort area. And I guess I feel like this whole process today is pointless, that the people who live there permanently, those of you that are on the committees, have made these decisions and are just trying to justify them to us today. And I also feel like when you buy a home in a place that is clearly a beach resort, you can expect traffic and noise. And that's all I have to say. Oh, sorry.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Wagner. I appreciate your comments, and I'll take a look at, off the top of my head, I'm not familiar with the Avian development that you mentioned, but I'll take a look at that. And we are working through test cases to make sure that our parking requirements make sense. We certainly don't want to restrict folks to parking requirements that don't make any sense or stop parking arrangements that are working for folks. So we'll take a closer look at that. And I appreciate your comments. We are certainly trying to get as much input as we can from short-term rental owners like yourself, people who are involved in the industry, and folks who live on the island. And I think I think this is a multifaceted issue with many concerns. And folks have brought up traffic. They've brought up the increased development on the island and less wild space on the island. And I appreciate all of those comments. And I think that everyone who has brought their perspective to this has been very helpful. Our recommendations at this point, and not saying that we wouldn't address additional recommendations in the future, our recommendations at this point are trying to address the specific nuisance issues that folks are having a problem with. And like I said, I appreciate that many people, especially folks who are as concerned as you are about short-term rentals, are probably good property managers to start with. So hopefully this isn't an additional burden for folks who already manage their properties well. Thank you very much for your comments. Ms. Moore? Ms. Moore, you may need to unmute yourself on your side. Ms. Moore?
Sorry, I'm trying to talk. Can you not hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you softly.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'll try to speak up. My husband and I have purchased back in 2015 with the intent in Palmetto Dunes with the intent of doing short-term rental. We did this because we knew it would be several years before we'd be retiring. However, we did intend to retire in Palmetto Dunes on Hilton Head. We are now, I guess, in a unique situation because we have done short-term rentals since 2015 very successfully, and we plan to retire there in the next 2 years. So I can see both sides of the coin, if you will. Couple of things I wanted to address because even though we plan to exit out of short-term rentals, I do think that short-term rentals bring a lot of benefits to the community of Hilton Head. I think there's a lot of amenities that we would not otherwise have because I don't think that the residential could support that. So I do think that short-term rentals benefit, and I think it's a coexistence. So the things that concern me more is that we purchased specifically in a neighborhood that allowed short-term rentals, and we actually paid a bit more because of that. We probably could have gotten another property at a different location that didn't allow short-term rentals for a lesser price. So I think if we start limiting too much, it could hurt the property values of those who purchased with that intent and want to resell at some point with that intent. And if they're not able to resell with that same benefit, it may hurt the purchasing or may hurt the sell value. The other thing is, I think we are doing a whole lot of work that may be unnecessary, in my opinion. I think someone else has already said this. If we start enforcing the rules we already have, I know Penalties takes it very seriously and is pretty good about this, but I mean, there's a number of rules and regulations. In fact, we post on the interior of our home already the rules and regulations. I send out an email to those folks. We rent through Airbnb. I limit the number of days. There's a minimum number of days that people can rent. I also limit the age of the primary rental. So I think there's a number of things we can do if they're just enforced. I mean, we are fortunate enough to have a permanent resident lives on our street that, you know, will give us a text. Aside from Palmetto Dunes, we get a text from our neighbor if our renters are doing something that is out of line, and we appreciate that, and we do enforce that. So, you know, I think that, you know, there are things that can be put in place. I do have a huge problem with, I think several people, and I joined a little bit late, so I'm sorry I missed some of this, but I do have a problem with posting contact numbers on the exterior of the house, or that can be viewed from the exterior of the house. As someone else said, I think that is a huge inconvenience to a guest, that somebody would come up and approach the house. And also, I just don't like having our numbers posted or having for whoever to see, be it somebody that would be aware and could do harm to our house, realizing there's no one there, or whatever. I don't like that idea at all. I want to be very clear about that. Also think that there should be some grandfathering considered. So people that have made investments on the island with a certain purpose, and they factored those things in whenever they made that purchase, I think is just, you know, grossly unfair to go changing rules, if you will, midstream, because they've already made a significant purchase on the island, made that investment, and to go back and change the rules, which could make them make entirely different decisions, not invest, etc. I don't think that's fair to go back and make those things. But again, as far as, you know, parking and several of the other things that are considered to be nuisances, I think there are already rules in place. I do agree with the gentleman that spoke earlier that said, you know, perhaps before permits are granted for the party houses, so to speak, you know, that should be a better avenue to take. I also, and I think I share that with a lot of people, I don't want Hilton Head to turn into a big party atmosphere. It's always been, and I've been coming for many years before we purchased, it's always been very family oriented. Love all the things that Hilton Head has to offer, which I think is different from other beach communities, and I'd like to see that maintained. But I think there are better ways than putting all the burden onto the short-term rental community. I think, you know, through doing some things proactive, and also through enforcement of some of the rules are already there. And if there are areas, I'm more familiar with Dunes, obviously, since I live there, but if there are areas that don't have those, then perhaps instating some kind of ordinances for those areas that don't already have a governance over them as an HOA may make more sense than, you know, doing something island-wide. That's it.
Thank you very much for your comments. I really appreciate it. And you mentioned that you joined us late, and thank you for joining us. A recording of the webinar will be available on the town's website, and also recordings from our other webinars. So please check that if you'd like, and the presentation will be available as well. And just a couple of comments that you made. I appreciate your point about safety and privacy. And we are going to discuss that and moving forward with what we're recommending for contact information and how to address that. So I appreciate you bringing that up. As did another.
Looks like I'm up next.
As did another caller. I appreciate that. Regarding grandfathering, I think we've heard from so many folks who are exactly in the position that you're in, that you want to retire to the island and that you bought a property that you are renting short term between the time you bought it and the time you're going to move. There's so many folks who are in that position, and I completely appreciate that. I think before we would consider any regulations that would impact people's property rights and your property rights, that requires a pretty significant conversation and an understanding on a deep level of what the consequences of that would be. I think that the regulations that we're proposing now should be just in line with standards and expectations for businesses that we have, that you're probably meeting, and everyone, you know, who is taking good care of their property is already meeting. So hopefully the burden would be additional paperwork, and that would be the extent of it, because you have a well-managed property. So I hope that addresses some of your points, but I really appreciate you participating today, and thank you for your comments. All right. Ms. Glasscock?
Yes, hi. I
Hi.
also own in Palmetto Dunes. And first of all, I want to thank so many of the speakers today. One of my biggest concerns was the first guy who was from the security background, and the second gentleman who had all those really valid points. I got to say, I got to commend him for all his research. But I am also speaking up because I figure many of us need to speak up about posting our private numbers or information outside. That is really a breach of personal. You have people who will abuse that. People who, you know, are the Gladys Kravitz neighbors who's going to complain about everyone, going to be calling you at 3 o'clock in the morning. I mean, we limit our rental. We manage it personally. We do have a license. We are registered. We just renewed. So we know not till 2023 now do we need to meet the specifications. But we limit it to 4 people, 25 or older. We don't list that we have a pull-out sofa. We try to discourage crowds, and we try to keep families and elderly mostly with our restrictions. I have all the, sorry, I just came downstairs, so I'm out of breath. I have the list of the Palmetto Dunes neighborhood rules, not only listed in the condo, but also I leave my number at security. So if someone needs to reach me that way, they can. But I don't want my personal information there. And I can't guarantee if I'm on a 3-hour flight that I can respond in an hour. And I mean, I could leave it with my sons, but I don't know, they'll probably just say, I'll get back to you once I speak to my mom. And but I really, and I also send out a welcome email with every incoming guest saying all the rules, with a copy of the Palmetto Dunes security rule video that's on YouTube, and I attach that to my letter. So I do every precaution I can take to make sure. And if one of my guests is disruptive, I would want to know. I would rate them and never have them again. I don't care if they want to call the police and have them involved if they're really that rowdy, but I've never run into any complaints. So I'm assuming we have a good crowd, but you can't really know what a person's going to be like. You know, you take all your precautions, but it's really hard to know. And I saw something about penalties being thought of, and I'm like, can it be directly on the renters? Because I mean, how you take all your precautions, people are people, you can only do so much to prevent stuff. So I guess my 2 points there is about the penalties and on the listing of the personal information, because I really do think that's a security breach or risk, I should say. And it's really, people can abuse that. And that's pretty much all. And I thank you so much. You've been really, really patient.
Oh, sure. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your comment about security and your concern about that. Thank you for mentioning that. The other The other note that you mentioned was penalties. As I mentioned before, the same issue with parking, where the goal is for voluntary compliance with town ordinances. Other municipalities, other places, New York City or something like that will issue parking tickets and tow you and that kind of thing. And the philosophy that the town has had in the past with issues of code enforcement is education first. Let people know, especially because we have so many people who are visiting us who maybe don't understand our community, don't understand, well, I can park on the beach, somewhere in Florida. Well, we have different standards here. We don't drive, on the beach here. So I think there's a lot of education that needs to take place. And in terms of enforcement, our goal would be to make sure that not that we're punishing property owners for the bad actions of an outlying renter. As much as you can screen folks before they, stay with you and rent your property, you're going to have some bad apples. But I don't think that the intention is to penalize property owners for the behavior of people that they can't control. I think the idea is to educate property owners and say, you own a business, it's a different type of business, but it is a business. And there are certain performance expectations that we would have. So hopefully most of those expectations you're already meeting. In the case for folks who own the short-term rental and aren't meeting those expectations, we would educate them about how to meet those expectations and what we would expect. And if we have someone who just will not, meet those standards, probably folks who maybe just aren't repeatedly following the rules and aren't communicative with us, the penalty would be considering revoking their business license to operate that business. So that's our consideration of enforcement. And I hope that's clarifying and helpful. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. All right, Mr. Hanson.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Just one very quick question. I hear a lot about or discussion about the noise and rowdiness. Is there any data, you've collected a lot of data, of the 11,000 short-term rental units, how many complaints have we had over the course of last year? Is it 50% of them have a complaint? Is it 10%? Is it 80%? Do we have those numbers? That's it.
Sure, I appreciate your question. And we've been asked that quite a bit, that folks want to know how widespread of an issue is this. Currently, the complaints about short-term rentals go to either one of three places. Folks call the sheriff's department, folks call the town for code enforcement, or folks call the property management company or the owner. So in the case of the sheriff's department, they, as you may expect, well, they don't regulate trash and they don't really regulate parking. When they are responding to a call, their report, if they give a report, and in the case of noise violations, they don't typically necessarily do a report, they don't find out whether it's a short-term rental or note that necessarily. For our town code enforcement, we found that many of the issues that have come up during hours that they don't normally do patrols. Now they have special patrols, but primarily during business hours during the day. Obviously, we wouldn't have a record of violations that go directly to the property management company or to the owner. So the continual monitoring software that we're taking a look at, there are modules that you can add to track code enforcement. So I think we'll have a much better understanding of code enforcement if we choose to use that module so that we can manage those numbers. What we're hoping to do is use the lowest cost method for property owners, which is their existing business license, and set a baseline of standards, which is we expect that you would, let folks know that we have a noise ordinance. We expect folks to put their trash in this location. We expect folks to park on site in designated spaces. We're hoping that that will relieve some of the nuisance issues and that we can address those issues through this new ordinance and relieve some of those complaints that you receive. Now, if you take a look at the feedback that we've received in stakeholder meetings, In the open houses and on the open town hall survey, there are many people whose quality of life is fairly severely impacted by short-term rentals, unfortunately. For some folks, it ranges to a nuisance issue. To some folks, it's a pretty serious impact on their quality of life. So I think if we set a baseline standard for these short-term rentals as operating as a type of business, we can alleviate some of those issues for the folks who are most impacted by those. I really appreciate your question, and thank you for joining us today. Is it Mr. Mangione? Mr. Mangione?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to speak. I'm a retired law enforcement officer of 31 years and a new owner in your area, and I am a short-term rental landlord. In terms of my retired profession, I have serious concerns regarding posting owner information outside of a home. In terms of crime prevention, it would raise a red flag and safety concerns for anybody, especially if the home were vacant. And I can equate that to when I used to work patrol, we, for our alarm response ordinance, if it was a false alarm, we would hang a door hanger on the front door. And that was very short-lived because that was a red flag to people that, okay, we just had an alarm here. And there's clearly nobody home because there's a door hanger on the front door. Well, in the same sense, this would be the same thing. If somebody knocked on the door and there was nobody home, it's assumed that it might be vacant. And as well as if somebody goes up to read the information in order to make a complaint, they would potentially put themselves at risk when making contact or should a renter be inside and then making contact with those individuals. There should be, when considering this ordinance, there should be a distinction between single-family residents and multifamily resident resorts that have HOAs with an enforcing security department. It could be easily, having worked for city government, it could be easily misconstrued as, well, that's not really the spirit of the ordinance, so we're not going to enforce that, or we are when it's really not the spirit of it, when things may not apply as they relate to single family and multifamily. The parking situation sounds to me that it is more single family street parking area based on what I've been hearing so far. And if there are parking issues inside of a multifamily property, that would be considered private property and up to those property owners or HOAs to enforce their parking laws if they are appropriately signed. If it was street parking, if it's appropriately signed by local or state law, then of course the police department should handle that enforcement if it goes beyond the education aspect that you've previously described. What might be a good way too, in speaking and listening to one of the previous owners, is that rules that the city might want to implement, maybe it's a good idea to just require homeowners to list those rules in their rental contracts or a separate document in addition that they would email later, as opposed to creating an ordinance itself. And that might resolve the problem because there's your education piece by doing that. As a previous caller mentioned, the 1 hour response time for an owner, that is pretty unreasonable. I myself am going to be going on a flight next week, and there would be no way for me to respond to a complaint within an hour if that were to be implemented. And that's all I have. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it. I appreciate your comments about posting information and security. As a couple previous participants have mentioned, that's a real concern for them. And we'll take a look at that and see what our options are to make sure that we have a good balance between folks being able to find a contact to resolve issues and protecting folks' privacy so that they don't feel that they're being either targeted for security issues or picked on by maybe a discontent neighbor. I appreciate your comment about parking, single family versus multifamily. We have had, I think you're correct. I think in a well-managed HOA or POA in a multifamily situation, they will, or an actively managed, I should say, the parking issues are resolved with notifying and towing people. We have heard from some folks who say, I have an HOA, I live in a POA, and they don't, this isn't being taken care of. So we're hoping that having some basic standards for the operation of short-term rentals will relieve some of those issues. I think requiring a list of rules in your rental contract, that would be, unless I'm missing something, I think that would be required through an ordinance also. We would have to have an ordinance saying you have to have this in your rental contract. So I'm not sure that's too different from what we're requiring now, but I appreciate your comments and thank you for joining us today. Ms. Bradford?
Hey, Ann, thanks for taking my call. I'm a short-term rental owner in Shipyard, and I live in New York City. So can you just clarify, because I don't think people who are Airbnb renters like myself, and there are a lot of us who don't use management companies, can you just clarify that someone on the island has to be available in an hour, that it can't be us taking that phone call and resolving the situation?
Our goal is performance, not method, if that's helpful. So if you are able to, if you're in a situation where you are in a POA or an HOA or a community that has a security team that can coordinate with you to respond to issues, it could be that meets the intent of being able to respond to within an hour to an issue.
Okay.
Now, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's helpful for me because Shipyard has their own security. So I guess I would just have to be available for them to go deal with the situation. I didn't want to have to go hire an expensive management company.
I think that's exactly what we're trying to avoid, is that I think most folks manage their short-term rentals well, and they have a system in place that works for them. Some folks don't.
Okay.
And so, yeah, we're trying to, for folks who have a system in place that works for them, trying to craft an ordinance that avoids making them pay for something they don't need to pay for.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for joining us. Ms. Gambino?
Oh, hi, this is actually Mr. Gambino.
Oh, Mr. Gambino.
Yeah, we had a little mix up in the link, so she's on me and I'm on as her.
Okay.
So Ann, first of all, I'd like to thank you for everything you're doing. I've got quite a history in town government, so I know everything that you're going through here to kind of pull this together. I want to start off by kind of saying some of my observations. We became aware of this only a few months ago, and through it, my first point of this as I was filling out the survey is I really had no clue what the underlying problem was. You know, is the underlying problem really short-term renters? Is the underlying problem the ordinances in place not being enforced? What is really driving this effort? And I still, after this call, am still a little confused about that. We are a short-term renter owner. We own in North Forest Beach. We have a house that we take great care of, and we do a pretty good job screening our guests, and we really cater it to families. We post all the rules and we do everything right. And as far as we know, we've been pretty good about this with not a lot of problem tenants at all through the history. So here comes my concerns, right? Number one, I think one of the previous callers said that you're kind of targeting short-term renter owners without really knowing the underlying problem. When you just went to kind of quote the stats a few minutes earlier, that confirmed it for me, right? There are no hard and fact data yet about short-term renters versus people just loaning their house out versus the size of the house, things like that. And I really think that kind of going forward with ordinances targeting short-term renters for these problems is a little bit the cart before the horse. You know, when I've done projects similar to this in town government before, when you're starting to do an ordinance, you have to start with a real problem statement. What is it that we're trying to fix with this ordinance? And I don't see that anywhere here. As we're getting more into it, what I see is that we have a number of ordinances in Hilton Head that aren't being enforced. And that to me is really the underlying problem. You've got trash, you've got security, and you've got parking, right? And if those ordinances are in place and we're not going to support them, just making the renter owners responsible for it isn't going to change anything. And I'm worried about three things with this. I'm worried about the privacy that everyone's brought up, but I'm also worried about now, we use a management company for our rental unit, and we have one rental unit. I'm worried about them now having to become a security company. They're not a security company. So how are they going to enforce the things right now that the town isn't willing to enforce at this point in time? There's no teeth to this ordinance at all. You're expecting regular residents and homeowners, because we are still homeowners, you know, in the area, to go out and to enforce the ordinances that the town's unwilling to do. And I think this has got to be thought through a lot more before we move ahead with that. I'm also worried about the enforceability of the parking. Like, we're not going to be able to make guests put the parking passes in their car. And if the town's not enforcing it as it is now, that ordinance is not going to get really where you want to go with it, because you're going to be in the same boat with expanded ordinance and expanded education, but no enforceability. So I really think, you know, we're going about this a little bit backwards. And before we start to look at putting the burden of the enforcement of this on short-term owners, or I really think the town has to kind of take a step back and see how they can enforce some of these things first, because it does seem like to me the problem isn't necessarily the short-term renters, it's the number of people, you know, in the island, whether they're coming from short-term or not, and them not following some of the rules that are already in place there. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for your comments. I know you covered a lot of ground there. I want to touch on a couple of things. In terms of the underlying problem and the problem statement, there is a problem statement for the initiative. And as staff presented it to the committee on Thursday, we sort of divided it into two areas. There are immediate nuisance issues that have been brought up. And I think that if you, most folks in their neighborhood, if you live in a neighborhood where the property is a short-term rental or a long-term rental, if you've lived there for a little while, you know who rents their property and who doesn't. You know who the short-term rentals are. So the folks who are answering the survey, participating in our open house and stakeholder meeting groups, who say there's some real nuisance issues with some short-term rentals. Some of them are not well managed. They know what properties are short-term rentals. They live in the neighborhoods. In terms of some of the larger problems that folks have mentioned, or larger concerns that they have, there's too much traffic on the island. You know, there's a change in one of the things that hasn't been brought up yet today, but that I've heard in a lot of the stakeholder meetings is there's a change in attitude of folks who are visiting, who are maybe less respectful, or you know, leave more trash, or a little bit noisier than folks that they've noticed a trend in that change. And some of those larger issues, I think, is entirely correct, that you can't say the increase on traffic on the island is due to short-term rentals, and the increase in short-term rentals, or this issue of overdevelopment is related to short-term rentals, and that's not what we're trying to say. What we found is that there is a baseline expectation that short-term rental owners and that guests and the community expect for, if you rent out your home and you operate it, you know, you have a business, you are you know, making money off of renting out your house, that there are some expectations that the community and residents have. And most folks meet those expectations. And there are some outliers. And again, the folks who live in those neighborhoods know which properties are being rented out short-term and not. They may not know the owners, because the owners may not have ever met the owners, but they know that those properties are being rented out short-term, whether they're currently occupied or not. So I hope that addresses your question about a problem statement. And I noted the other comments that you mentioned about enforceability of parking and privacy, and I appreciate the rest of the input that you gave us today. Thank you very much for joining us. All right, Mr. Loken. Mr. Logan, you may need to unmute on your end.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks. Actually, my question is kind of, or comment is kind of related to what you just touched on in the previous gentleman. First, I'll say, you know, I guess my comment would be about the traffic. I would wonder if these concerns had been brought up, you know, in the last 2 years. We also can't ignore that the last 2 years have been, brought on with the COVID and the pandemic. And I think people have been, as a trend, been traveling to other places, whether it's their own second home or renting a place that, communities that were not typically fully occupied are seeing that they're fully occupied these times in these days. So I would think that whether these homes on the island were rentals or second homes to people, I think that in the last 2 years, it'd be easy to say that, people have generally been, leaving their primary residence and going to another location. So I think the island itself is just busy because people are getting away. But when it comes to the problem statement or the initiative statement, I was just wondering, you kind of started to unpack this a little bit, with the project statement saying that there's been an imbalance between residential and resort districts. Is that like, when you say resort districts, are we talking about the Palmetto Dunes, the Sea Pines, et cetera? So has it normally been balanced where it was primarily residential and the resort districts were not the primary, and now it's flip-flops? Could you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Sure, and thank you for your question. To your point about traffic increases and trends, I see your point, and I think started to unpack that, like you said, but I think some of the larger questions that folks have, short-term rentals, because they're such a large part of our economy and there has been a sharp change in them, I'm sure there is some of the increase in traffic is tied up with that, but I think that we shouldn't paint with a broad brush and say every issue, every negative externality that I'm experiencing is because of short-term rentals, and that's not what we're trying to say. And I think most people who have complaints recognize that. But to your point about the problem statement, we've talked with and heard from folks in areas that are both in large gated communities like Sea Pines and in areas that are outside of gated communities who have both lived there. We talked to folks who have lived there for 40 years, and we've talked to folks who have lived there for 10 years. And in some areas of the island, there has been a transition from those traditional residential areas from either an even mix of short-term rentals and single-family homes to a majority of short-term rentals and a minority of single-family homes. So there's been a change in the character of those neighborhoods. And in some of those areas, so North Forest Beach, Volley Field, those areas where, 40 years ago, there was a much different mix of folks in those neighborhoods. And the long-term residents who are in those areas have definitely felt a change in the character. They felt like, I bought my property in an area which is zoned for single-family residential use. That is the use that I have, but that use is being changed, has changed over time. So that's the concern that's been brought up by folks. And that's something that I think that we need to continue to examine in monitoring the number and location of short-term rentals, and in considering some larger island-wide trends, I think, and discuss that further. So the first part of our recommendations are to set a baseline of expectations for the operation of short-term rentals, which again, most people already meet and should be hopefully a minimum amount of burden and requirements for those owners, but should provide relief to those experiencing those nuisance issues in a way that they can address those in an effective way. The larger part of the question, trends, changes in character of neighborhoods, some of the issues of, folks have brought up caps on short-term rentals, a maximum number of occupants. Those are larger issues that I think at this point we need additional information to be able to effectively address. And we plan to gather that information along with the trends in short-term rentals so that we can have a deeper conversation about that. So I think it's a long answer to your question, but hopefully I addressed what you were asking. And thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Mr. Carlson?
Hey, Ann. So I recognize the fact that you're, the host of the meeting, and you're just the conduit for conversation. So at no point is any of this confrontational towards you. It's just a conversation about this potential ordinance. Okay. So to touch on a few things. One, I think if you took a survey of any resident that's been anywhere in the entire country from 40 years ago to today, we have a substantially increased population and everything has changed everywhere in the entire US. So to simply ask somebody who's been a 40-year resident, what do you think? That really doesn't hold any water as compared to literally the entire country. When we start talking about, what is the problem statement, as a couple other people have mentioned, you mentioned the problem statement was rooted in some issues such as someone who's lived in the neighborhood, quote, where the short-term rental is. Well, that is painting with a broad brush, because when we look at actual facts, the sheriff's office doesn't have any data. And it sounds like code enforcement doesn't have any data. So really, the only facts are actually opinions or conjecture. So that's an issue, because if we were to apply this to, let's say, workforce housing, about what people think is going to happen, is that what's going to happen or is it not? Because then that turns into an entirely different conversation, doesn't it? And as far as the education piece from the city, if anybody on city council took an unscientific survey from their friends and said, if you're going somewhere for 4 days a year, 7 days a year, did you go on that local municipality's website and specifically look up parking restrictions? I imagine the answer is going to be either 0 respondents in the affirmative or a significantly small percentage. People are concerned with packing sunscreen. They're concerned with their flip-flops. They're concerned with making sure the rental car reservation is on their phone for when they land. They're not concerned with education from a place they're going to 1 week a year. That is just not happening. I think for people who live in places, then yes, education probably works. But from what it sounds like, these are not people that live here. So again, hoping for the best and saying, well, we're just going to give education and not enforce anything is not an answer. It's an easy way out to pass the buck and assume that things are going to be solved, but that's just not realistic. By and large, if you have proper signage, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse here, but I keep hearing this education. Sounds like you've tried it, and it seems like it's not working. Proper signage provides the immediate education of what is expected. The expectation is no parking. If you choose to park there, the education is, or violators will be ticketed or towed. So you've provided immediate education, immediate information, and people can make their choice, at which point it is enforceable. So I think a lot of this stuff is trying to, as many other people on here have said, pass the buck on to business owners, because now property owners are business owners, even though most of us are not. And the reality is the buck will be passed back to the city because they're not enforcing what's currently on the books. Furthermore, on these webinars and all these people, I have not heard one person come and say, yes, this is awesome. Let's move forward. I can't believe this didn't happen sooner. In fact, quite the contrary. Everybody either seems to be really opposed to it or has a significant number of issues with what's being presented. So I don't know whose idea this is or what the end goal is, but it doesn't sound like most of the constituents that are on these calls are on board with what's going on. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson. I appreciate it. I think you covered a couple points that you've covered before, and your point's well taken. I just want to mention that I think certainly we wouldn't expect guests to educate themselves on the local municipality rules. One of the recommendations that we're proposing is a good neighbor brochure, which I think has been effective in communities. And we've heard from communities saying, posting information that they expect visitors to adhere by in a way that is accessible to them, and maybe a couple different methods. Maybe, folks aren't inclined to read notifications when they get to a short-term rental. They're excited to be in their location, but perhaps posting, photos or some sort of other educational method to reach folks, through an app or something like that could be an option to educate folks. But I think that, again, I think there's a balance between, welcoming people to the community and enforcing expectations, but not necessarily making people feel like they're being punished for making a simple mistake when they're on vacation in terms of parking. I think that's what we're trying to avoid. But I take your point about enforcement, and there are some limits to education. I take your point. Thank you. Mr. Prohaska?
Yeah, I'd like to circle back to the house hotels, party houses. Most of these, if not all of them, are rented through Airbnb and VRBO, which are no contact rentals anymore. You book online, you get an email with all your information, and you show up. In fact, in my research, I found a gentleman who's a host named Greg, who brags about having built 3 of these 30 plus house hotels on the island. I think when we kind of narrow it down to this, if you have a noise ordinance that says no noise after 10 and you post all that information, house parties just get started at 10. We're seeing people coming in for bachelor parties, bachelorette parties. Their design at, paying $35 to $50 a night is to party for a week. And I'm just going to share one example, real life, that occurred on, I believe it was on North Forest Beach, a bachelor party that at approximately sometime after 10, I'm thinking it was more like 1 when it was relayed to me, the 65-inch TV screen out by the pool was projecting pornography. So what do you do at that point? You pick up the phone at 1 in the morning as a neighbor and contact the owner, who's sound asleep in New York City, and say, you got an hour to come solve this problem. Or you call the police, who come out, ask them to turn it off, they do, police leave, and they turn it back on. I really believe the issue you're facing, again, is these house hotels, which probably should be regulated as hotels of some form. And that's what you need to be zeroing in on, not me and my 2-bedroom condo in a 30-unit building, or the person in Sea Pines who has a 3-bedroom house that they rent when they're not here and maybe have 1 issue in 20 years. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your comments. And, hopefully, I think the number and issues with party houses are hopefully limited. I'm not sure about the size regulations, but hopefully what you mentioned is a more isolated incident than not. But thank you for commenting, and I appreciate you joining us today. Okay, Ms. Moore?
Yes, I'm sorry. One last thing. Hopefully you can hear me. Again, I just want to reiterate that once we get the data, which I think several people have pointed out that we don't know, we're kind of making assumptions based on anecdotal data. But once we get the data and we can zero in on where the true problems are, I feel like it might be much more effective to address those particular houses, hotels, whatever we want to call them, or those folks that are creating problems and being irresponsible, if you will, rather than trying to design an entire ordinance, putting a burden on the people at large. I mean, if you look at the analogy of, back when we were all in grade school, the whole class had to stay inside because one kid was being disruptive. I think we all kind of feel like the other kids in the class, if you will. So, I mean, I think if we just kind of start to find out where the real problems are and zero in on those problems and enforce the rules for those violators, because I do think there's a number of rules already for violators, we would be a lot more effective than making some broad brush regulations for everybody. And if there are certain areas that don't have HOAs and need to have those regulations, then perhaps creating HOAs or creating some kind of ordinance for those areas that are unregulated. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your comments. I really appreciate it. as I said, we are trying to, and understanding that most short-term rentals are well managed, to create a baseline set of expectations that I think most short-term rental owners are already putting in place in one way or another, and to create that baseline set of expectations for folks. Hopefully that is a way that we can address some of those nuisance issues without over-regulation or additional fees for folks. I just want to mention, for anyone who's joined us late and would like to raise a hand and ask a question, at the bottom of your screen, there's a raise hand icon. If you click that, staff will know that you'd like to ask a question. We have 7 more minutes before we're due to wrap up for today. And there's also a Q&A box where if you want to type in a question, you can do that down there. And a recording of this webinar and a copy of the notes for the questions that were asked will be added to the town's website. There's also, I just want to mention, while we've still got a few people on here, that there are 2 more opportunities for input in person this week. The first is a stakeholder meeting focused on residential property rental companies, and that's going to be from 3 to 4:30 p.m. tomorrow. And the other is our third open house, which will be on Thursday, February 3rd from 2:30 to 4:30. And you can register for one or both of those sessions the same way that you registered for today's meeting on the town's website. You'll also find on the town's website a form where you can submit comments. And I would appreciate everyone who is interested in this issue to submit comments. Those are shared with the Public Planning Committee and reviewed by staff. I would encourage you to do that, and encourage if you have neighbors or friends who have comments who would like to submit them, to do that way. Please note that our survey, we've had a great response so far. We've had 3,600 respondents, which we really appreciate everyone's time and attention to that. That does close today. So if you want to participate, please make sure that you do that today. I don't see any additional raised hands. Okay, if we don't have any remaining questions, well, we might have one. Mr. Is it Always?
Always, yes, Ann.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I would like to know what exactly is the definition of the short-term rental and how many days? And I just don't see the data that associates short-term rentals with noise, trash, parking, and traffic that other people have raised in the past. And it appears to me, and other property owners have stated this, that it appears to me that the underlying problem is a lack of ordinance enforcement. And if the city of Hilton Head Island is reluctant to enforce the ordinances, then I can see why so many property owners are getting upset that they can't get some of the issues resolved with, noise, trash, and parking. I mean, there comes a time when the city has to get involved, especially the police, and enforce the regulations and the ordinances. Because if the city doesn't, then the people are going to become, which they are apparently, more and more frustrated that they can't get their issues resolved. And I manage my own rental unit, and I take that responsibility very seriously. And I have it in my rental agreement and the information packet, some of the rules that the people should be following, and, to be a good neighbor. But at the same time, I have experienced where I've talked to a renter, not mine, but another renter, about, all the like dog noise, not picking up after their dog waste, and they ignore you. And if you call the police, they're going to say, we don't get involved in that. well, they should get involved. Or, you know, the city should list and take it and be responsible and say that you need, if you have a complaint and you complain to the individual and they're not responding in an appropriate manner, then you should be able to call the police and they should get involved. I mean, as a property owner that has rental property, I believe that we're paying a disproportionate share of taxes also, but that's another issue. But at the same time, I'm a taxpayer. And if I voice a concern to the police or to the Hilton Head Island, the city, they should respond. It shouldn't be, we're not going to get involved. They should be directly, they should get involved. They shouldn't be reluctant to get involved. And, you know, some of the hard feelings and the resentment against people who have rental property, you know, to me, some of this should be burdened by the Hilton Head Island with their lack of involvement. So, and then the last thing I want to know is if these ordinances are put into effect, you know, what metrics are going to be used to measure the success of the ordinance? Because you still have a large influx of people that come in on weekends and they're not even renting on the island, and they come in and they're parking everywhere. They're coming onto the beach, and if the police aren't going to identify who is a short-term renter versus a transient person who only comes in for a day, I mean, I don't know how you're going to measure the success of this program. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alvis. I appreciate you participating today, and your points are well taken. I think it's part of the conversation that we've had in this process is who, you know, bears the burden of the impacts of short-term rental visitors on the island. And we're trying to find a solution to some of those nuisance issues that has the least amount of burden to short-term rental property owners, at the same time recognizing that they do operate a business and have some responsibility for the management of that business. So I think the solution that we found and what we've heard from most folks is I manage my property really well. I don't want to pay any additional fees, and you know, I don't need a lot of extra regulations. And I think what we've tried to find is a solution that addresses those nuisance issues by putting the least amount of burden on short-term rental owners. I mean, there are other communities that we've looked at who, you know, require a separate registration fee for a short-term rental. You know, the annual fees can range from $100 to $200 a year, or $300 for 2 years, or however, you know, folks want to address that, and use, you know, separate, you know, use those funds to operate a code enforcement for, you know, both software tracking and enforcement for those issues. Now, like I said, all of the options, or excuse me, all of the negative issues that people brought up, I know sometimes it's easy to bundle things together and say, you know, the issue of, you know, too much at the beach or parking here or there isn't strictly related to short-term rentals, but we have identified some problems with short-term rentals, specifically noise that's pretty excuse me, easily identifiable, parking issues, and some trash issues. So like I said, we're trying to find the least burdensome way to effectively establish some minimum property management standards, some basic standards that we all agree most properties that are well managed already meet these standards. So I hope that addresses your questions, and your points are well made. I just want to mention before we sign off here today, because we are out of time, that again, this is not your last opportunity to participate. We are still listening and still taking your input, and we need your input, and I really appreciate that. Please submit your comments if you don't participate in one of the 2 remaining meetings in the form on the town website. And that, again, that information is shared with the committee and staff reviews that information. Again, I'd like to thank the town council members who are able to join us today. Ms. Becker, Mr. Ames, Mr. Lennox, and Mr. Brown. I saw we're on the call today. And thank you to staff, especially Renee Phillips, who's running the webinar, but also to Terry Lewis, Nicole Dixon, Teresa Haley, and Jamie Lopko for helping to facilitate our webinar today. Thank you all so much for participating. A recording of this will be available on the town's website, along with a summary of the questions that were asked for your reference. So again, thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.